הליכוד בראשות נתניהו היא המפלגה הגדולה עם 30 מנדטים, ירידה של 6 מנדטים מהכנסת הנוכחית, אבל עדיין במרחק גדול מהמפלגה השנייה בגודלה ועוד יותר גדול משאר המפלגות. אחריה יש עתיד של יאיר לפיד שיורדת עם ספירת המעטפות הכפולות ל17 מנדטים והיא המפלגה השנייה בגודלה בכנסת. ש"ס המפלגה השלישית בגודלה והשנייה בגוש תומכי נתניהו עם 9 מושבים. אחריה כחול לבן שהפכה לאחת מהפתעות הבחירות עם 8 מנדטים. יהדות התורה שומרת על כוחה עם 7 מושבים בכנסת הבאה. גם ימינה של נפתלי בנט עם 7 מנדטים נתון מאכזב עבורה ביחס לציפיות. העבודה בראשות מרב מיכאלי חוזרת לחיים עם 7 מנדטים. גם ישראל ביתנו של אביגדור ליברמן עם 7 מנדטים, היא מקבלת מנדט נוסף ממש ברגע האחרון על חשבון יש עתיד. הרשימה המשותפת צונחת ל6 מנדטים בלבד בכנסת הבאה. תקווה חדשה של גדעון סער שהתחילה את הקמפיין כהבטחה הגדולה, מסיימת את מערכת הבחירות עם 6 מנדטים בלבד. 6 מנדטים גם לציונות הדתית של סמוטריץ' ובן גביר. מרץ מקבלת עם ספירת המעטפות הכפולות מנדט נוסף ועולה ל6 מנדטים. מרץ עושה את זה על חשבון רע"מ של מנסור עבאס, שיורדת ל4 מנדטים, אבל תיכנס לכנסת. וזו תמונת הגושים הסופית, תומכי נתניהו בלי בנט עם 52 מנדטים, גם עם ימינה ו7 המנדטים שלה מגיע הגוש ל59 מנדטים בלבד. מתנגדי נתניהו עם 57 מנדטים, ורע"מ עם 4 מנדטים היא המפלגה המחוזרת.
ושלא יפחדו, ותרגיע אותם שלא יפחדו מהקורונה, זה סתם פרובוקציות וניסיון סתם לשבש את הבחירות. אין בעיה, הכל שם בשליטה, אין בעיה כזו.
The ballot box. Their 4th elections in 2 years, one that could be detrimental for Benjamin Netanyahu. While the Israeli Prime Minister is riding the vaccination campaign, protests and an anti-corruption trial spell trouble for Bibi. So the question remains, will vaccines be his saving grace?
Israelis made a trip to the ballot boxes, their 4th time in 2 years. From Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to Israeli President Reuven Rivlin, leaders and citizens were seen voting in an election that determines Israel's future. The pandemic election was momentous. Half of Israel's population has received a jab, and for those who haven't, precautionary measures were taken. Ballot boxes were kept at the airport for those coming home to vote. For those who tested positive for COVID-19, Israel had separate polling stations where they could drive through and cast their vote. For the patients in hospitals, ballot boxes were wheeled to their bedsides so that they could make their voices heard.
While it is the 4th time and it's a bit frustrating, and I also don't believe it will help much. But we will make our efforts and God will make the rest.
The elections had 4 main contenders: Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of the Likud party, Benny Gantz of the Blue and White party, Gideon Sa'ar, who defected from Netanyahu's Likud to form his own New Hope party, and Yair Lapid of the center-left Yesh Atid party. For Netanyahu, the star of his campaign was Israel's vaccination drive. The country has rolled out the world's fastest vaccination campaign.
אנחנו עכשיו יוצאים.
לא עובד, לא עובד, לא עובד, זה באמת לא עובד.
מדינת ישראל לא צריכה ולא יכולה לממן 140,000 אברכים ותלמידי ישיבות. עד שלא נבין שכולם חייבים לקחת חלק בנטל, לא נצא מהמשבר הכלכלי.
מחליפים את השלטון, מצילים את הכלכלה.
Ever closer to another election. It would be the 4th one in 2 years. A preliminary date has been set for March 16, 2021. A majority of Israeli lawmakers voted to dissolve parliament in a preliminary reading.
Unfortunately, and I'm saying the truth, Benny Gantz reneged on the agreements between us, and this decision is dragging the State of Israel into elections. And I think it happened, and this isn't a secret, because of an internal fight in his party. He reneged because of his insistence to continue giving Nissenkorn against the coalition agreement to advance a dictatorship of left-wing bureaucrats, and these bureaucrats are ruining the will of the people.
This brings Israel closer to its fourth round of elections in 2 years. Disagreements over the 2020 budget have caused the latest political turmoil. The main issue is that the Israeli coalition cabinet can't really agree on anything. Israeli ministers accuse Israel's prime minister of lying and sidelining his demands, in particular a proposed budget, the same budget that hasn't been passed. Another election means Israelis have to pay hundreds of millions of dollars for it. Israel's elections are costly. They run upwards of $400 million per election. About 30% of that money, according to Channel 12, will go to party funding. Another 20% will go to party member loans. Israel has had 3 so far in less than 2 years. According to the Manufacturers Association of Israel, the latest 3 elections cost Israelis $3.8 billion. This calculation factors in the expense of election days that require businesses to close for the day. In Israel, any election day is a national holiday to facilitate voting. If businesses still open, according to the Israeli law, they need to pay their employees 200% of their normal salary for the day. The Calculation Manufacturers Association of Israel also includes party campaign budgets funded by Israel and the cost of operating the Central Elections Committee, which oversees the electoral process. Furthermore, with caretaker cabinets in place since December 2018, Israel's economic policies have been on hold, while the debt increased and costs continued. Costs incurred by the ongoing political maneuvering and ultimate stalemate that exist following the latest election results may be compounded by yet another election soon. The lack of a budget law has hurt the most vulnerable worst of all. The lack of a state budget has left working parents, especially lower income ones, with no immediate solutions to the problem.
You know, it's a lot of money, but I have to be frank with you and the audience. I want to say that this will bring problems and more crisis to the citizens of Israel, but it's not the main crisis in Israel. We can see now this cost of the new campaign and the election will make the crisis wider from one side and deeper from other side. It means that we are already in the crisis, and the election will bring more problems and to make this crisis wider and deeper. You know, everybody, that the election, the fourth one in less than 2 years, is out of the complicated crisis politically, economically, and the health and the corruption crisis in Israel. It's a reflex of this crisis. There is a new phenomena of this fourth election, different than the last 3 elections. In the last 3 elections, the main discussion were between the right-wing parties, Netanyahu and the Likud, and from the other side, the center and left forces and parties in, for example, Gantz and Labour Party and the Meretz and the Common List in the Arab side. But this election is not between these 2 forces. the right and from one side and the center left in the other side. Now the discussion, the main fight is between the right parties from the other side, other right parties, between the right parties together. And this is a new phenomena, wasn't in all the history of Israel from the first election on 1949 till now.
להצביע, כמו שחכמי ז"ל ציווה לנו, להצביע גימנו, נחמח מומה.
שעלה בכל בחירות, כל פעם מזכירים את זה, וזה כואב. כאילו עכשיו נגיד דיברו על זה שזה כסף שהולך לצאת מתוך כספים שילכו לאנשים כרגע בקשיים כלכליים, אנשים שמחוץ לבית, שכבר חיים ברחוב, וכואב, כואב לשמוע שבגלל הפילוג בעם אנחנו סובלים, באמת סובלים.
בחירות עולות הרבה כסף, אני לא יודע כמה בדיוק, וברור שלאור הקורונה יש אתגרים ויש מקומות שבהם הכסף נדרש יותר מאשר מערכה פוליטית נוספת.
דבר אחר חוץ מבחירות חוזרות וחוזרות וחוזרות, אבל יש לנו מציאות פוליטית כזאת שמאלצת אותנו לעשות את זה שוב, וחבל.
אין לדעת, המפה הפוליטית בישראל משתנה כל הזמן, ובאמת נראה שדברים הולכים כל פעם להיות אחרת, ויכול להיות שדברים לא יהיו אחרת.
רק שינוי בשיטת הבחירה שקיימת אצלנו, רק שינוי יכול להועיל, להביא איזשהו שינוי. שאנחנו עושים כל פעם את אותן פעולות, והם בעצם מגיעים לאותן תוצאות, שיסוע ודברים שאי אפשר לגשר עליהם. פשוט פערים מטורפים.
פחות טוב, והליכודיות החברתית נפגעה, ולכן מערכת בחירות נוספת עם כל האמוציות שבה עשויה לגרום לעוד קרע והגדלת הקרע ופגיעה במרקם החיים.
It should be quite clear that the Israeli economy is going to pay, and is already paying, a very heavy price for having a fourth elections in 2 years. But what many people overlook is the moral, psychological, and the motivational damage that is being caused. Because there's a large number of people from the Israeli middle class, and it doesn't really matter if it's center left or center right, who still believe that Israel is a Western, democratic, Zionist, normal state. And they still believe in the institutions of this state. And what they are discovering, or will discover, is that on top of the pyramid sits a man who will do everything in his ability to remain in power and will subvert the economic and political and justice system of the country. He will undermine it to achieve his goal. At the moment, Israel's debt lies at 14.5% of its GDP. Unemployment is at 20%. Poverty is at 29%. The Israelis don't need new elections at this time that will cost $400 million. What they need is good governance, and they need a budget, because there hasn't been a budget for 2020, nor for 2021. Nevertheless, elections are being held, and that is due to Benjamin Netanyahu's insistence on having a one-year budget plan. Netanyahu insisted on having a one-year budget plan, although he agreed to have a two-year budget plan earlier, because he wanted to have absolute control over the situation.
Israelis are upset about this because, according to KAN, the same troublemakers and lawmakers and officials in the Israeli cabinet and Knesset who are calling for a fourth election are the ones who benefit and are in some way rewarded for such political standoffs. And now they're going to get a reward for trying to convince Israelis to pick them again using their own tax money. Many of the members in the Knesset and the cabinet have been there running for their seats since the first election out of 3 seemingly failed ones. Israelis have lost confidence in them. It seems that no matter how much money is spent on their campaigns and how much fiscal funding they receive courtesy of Israeli taxpayers, they can't even pass a budget that will allow Israelis and Israel in general to function. Israelis believe that this is what the regime wanted. A fourth election looms because it is the only mechanism available to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to call new elections. For Netanyahu, a fourth race in under 2 years would have him not cede his office in November 2021 to his rival-turned-partner, Military Minister Benny Gantz. Netanyahu and Gantz have been circling each other for months. Netanyahu has been seeking to escape the clauses of his coalition agreement. Gantz has been struggling to hold him to it, and the budget has served as the main leverage in that fight. This leaves the Israeli public to be the outcasts in all of this, while they bear the biggest brunt. Hence, protesters, which are at their 28th week of protests, are calling for the downfall of the regime, simply because they have had enough.
Seems that every other week we have an election in Israel, but you know, when you have somebody like Netanyahu and you have a settler colonial project, you know, this is part of life. So I wanted really just to delve a little bit onto the current election outcome, and then also to provide some, maybe a little bit of a brief on the Israeli election itself and some of the dynamics. It says in Al Jazeera today, there was the final Israeli election results confirm deadlock. Really, there was no resolution among the electorate in Israel to be at a higher level. In just a brief about Israel's parliamentary elections, there were 39 parties that contested seats, and each party have to reach a threshold in order for it to qualify to hold a seat in the Israeli Knesset, which is the Israeli parliament. And in here, the 39 parties that were contested has also 2 Arab parties that participated. One is Arab and one is more of an Islamist party that participated in the election. And I need to at least give people an understanding that it is accurate to say that Palestinians who live in Israel 1948 area do vote in Israeli election, but in a sense they're considered almost a fourth, not a second class citizen.
most of the citizens of Israel are the main loser. But if we take it in the between parties and politically, we can see that Gantz and the Labour Party, it means the center and left, who were inside the coalition government, they will be the main loser as the political parties. The second loser will be Netanyahu himself, not the right wing as a political platform, but as the struggle against the corruption of Netanyahu. You know, and everybody knows that he is facing 3 corruption cases in the court, and he will be the main. They didn't reach to this budget because they know that the budget must bring a new hard decisions against the most of the citizens and the businesses out of the situation. They connect that with the political crisis in Israel and with the personal crisis of Netanyahu himself toward the corruption cases which he faced this time. For this reason, the budget issue is a symptom of the deep and wide, multiple and complicated crisis which Israel facing. This complicated crisis in Israel since the establishment of the State of Israel 1948 wasn't in this thing. But there is a part of this crisis where something the same. I want to remember, let's remember together, for example, if we are talking about the political crisis, we saw a political crisis before, like what was in Barak on 1999 in Camp David. And it was a big political crisis in that time that was in Israel. If we are talking about the economical crisis, we can see 2 main crises in the history in economics. One, it was on
משלמים על זה בסוף, ובאמת יש תחושה של איזה ניתוק מסוים, שההנהגה כבר לא מרגישה מחוברת אל העם שלה, שאנחנו כבר הרבה זמן משלמים בעד הבחירות האלה, ומרגיש שהפוליטיקאים לא מסכימים לעשות את הפשרות בשבילנו כדי לייצר ממשלה.
יכול להיות שאם ישנו את שיטת הבחירות, הדברים ישתנו, אבל כרגע, אם אנחנו ממשיכים להצביע באותה דרך, הכל ימשיך להיות אותו דבר. זאת אומרת, אי אפשר לצפות לקבל תוצאה אחרת שממשיכים באותה שיטה. זאת אומרת, איזשהו שינוי צריך להיות פה.
אני חושש שלא נגיע להכרעה ואנחנו נאלץ להיגרר לבחירות חמישיות ואולי יותר מכך. בסוף מי שמשלם על הבחירות זה התושבים, זה האזרחים שמשלמים מיסים כחוק והם יצטרכו לשלם את זה גם ברמה הכלכלית וגם ברמה החברתית, הפגיעה במרקם החיים החברתי במדינת ישראל.
The government don't care about the citizens in Israel, and we feel all the corruption in the government taking us down, and Israel is a proud country. We are proud people who try to save our free and democrat-only country in the Middle East. And because of this, the people of Israel is arising against the government.
What took place within the Israeli parliament most recently was that there was a vote to postpone reaching a decision regarding the budget. And while historically and most recently there's been a very strong opposition to Prime Minister Netanyahu from the center and from the left, now there's been a rebellion from the right, and there were members of the ruling Likud party, of all parties, who actually quit and either joined a new party or people from the right who were surprised by voting against the proposition. And this is what is enabling a fourth elections. So in fact there is a growing number of people who believe that they can unseat Netanyahu and remove him and believe that they could serve as better prime ministers. And it is their personal drive that is causing Israel to go for a fourth election. The reason elections are being held on such a frequent basis in Israel is due to the fact that there isn't a clear consensus. Israeli society is deeply fragmented and divided. Various political parties are pushing in various different directions. Due to the fact that Israel is a so-called democracy, because it's democracy for Jews only, but it's a parliamentary democracy, various parties can pull out when they wish and therefore bring down the coalition once the majority is not secured. And that gives increasing power to smaller political parties. The polarization within Israel is getting stronger and deeper, and elections are therefore being held on a more frequent basis as various parties and figures split, and even within these splits there are various new splits.
To make matters even worse, in a recent speech, Israeli military minister Benny Gantz told Israelis on live national TV that he knew Netanyahu is a serial promise breaker, and that Netanyahu lied to Israelis and did not lie to Benny Gantz, even though he formed a coalition with him. So-called Knesset opposition leader Yair Lapid said citizens shared the feeling that they lost control over their lives. The lack of budget for 2020 has contributed to hardships and cutbacks for Israelis, amid unemployment estimated at over 20%. It seems that as the new year looms, so does another election for Israel. The same parties and the same players are on the table. The only thing new would be the money that would have went to a 2020 budget. Now, it remains to be seen if a budget would ever get passed. This all the while Israelis suffer.
אני הרמתי ידיים! אתה רוצה אני הרמתי ידיים! אני הרמתי ידיים! אני הרמתי ידיים! אני הרמתי ידיים! מה אתם רוצים? מה אתם רוצים? מה אתם רוצים? לא, לא, הוא בן זוהר! אני יודע, אין מה
התפקיד שלך זה לשמור עלינו ואנשים כאלה. תסלק את המפגע מפה. תסלק מפה את המפגע הזה.
אסור לו להרים ידיים על המפגע. יש לי צילומים שלא דוחה. שלא מרים ידיים.
הוא לא ירביץ, הוא לא ירים ידיים.
Bom!